This tutorial is part of a YouTube playlist. You can access this and many more of the tutorials in this course. If you do like this YouTube playlist and you want to access the whole course, you can do on Udemy. The link to the YouTube playlist and YouTube course is in the video description. Let's take a look at how now we can define a modular project configuration with the current setup. Remember, we are using a factory approach, and that really blends and leans towards the idea of creating a very modular approach for our project. Let's first visualize what it is that we're doing. Now, when we run a Flask application, at the moment we are running the Flask application by typing in the terminal Flask run. Now, Flask by default is looking for a file called app.py, which we have created. Now, within this file, so here we are now within this file, remember it's looking and importing the create app function. Now remember, within this create app function is the method to actually create a new Flask instance. So what gets returned back into app.py, let's call that the Flask instance here. Now what we're doing in this tutorial is that when we create our Flask instance, we want to pass in some different configuration options. So we're going to create a configuration option for maybe development. We could create a configuration file for production. So this approach that we use here, we can adapt and create different types of configuration options for different environments that we're going to run this Flask application within. This is the modular approach that I've been describing. Now, typically when we create, say, a number of different configuration options for different settings, like here we have one for when we're developing in the development environment, and maybe we set up a different configuration file for production. So we can pick and choose which configuration file we want to use when we create a new instance. And typically these different configuration files would share a basic set of configuration. So what we can do first is create a basic configuration file, which we can then share those basic configuration options with maybe one or more of our custom configuration files. We can then create this custom configuration for either development or production, and then specify it when we create our Flask instance. So what we end up with when we run Flask run is a new Flask instance with our custom configuration. So this is very much like our shopping bag, and this will grow as we move into the next few tutorials. So at the moment, if we were to run our application after this tutorial, all that we would have is a Flask instance, an instance of our Flask application with the custom configuration set. Now, of course, what happens once Flask detects our Flask instance, it will create a new Flask server and then run the server and place our Flask application within so it can be accessible. And of course, by default, it uses port 5000. So then to access our Flask application within our browser, we just go ahead and type in the loopback address, which sends a message to our computer. Our computer then identifies the application that has registered or is listening to port 5000. In this case, it will be the Flask server, and then passes that message across to our Flask application. We will keep going back to this diagram. You'll start to see this bag, this shopping bag here, start to fill up with different configuration and options as we develop our application. So let's start by creating a new file. This is going to be specific to the application, so it's going to be in the fkcommerce folder. So we're going to create a new config file.py. Okay, so that's our config.file.py. That's our config.file.py. That's our config file, right? So let's now go ahead and create some configurations. Right, so I'm going to need to bring in potentially the environment variables, and we can access them through the OS module. So that's why we're going to import that in. And then in addition to that, what can be really useful as we develop our project, we might need access to the base directory of our project in order to access certain resources. So we can create a base directory here. So we use the OS module path.appspath So essentially all we're doing here is creating a variable and we're placing the path to our fkcommerce folder. That's going to be our base directory. Now we can find that by saying os.path and then dir name, directory name. We can find the directory name of where this file, now this file currently is the config file. So if we use the special underscore name underscore, no, underscore file underscore, what's going to happen is that it's going to look for where this file is placed. So where this config file is placed within this directory. And it's going to use that path, place that path into the base directory variable. So we can then utilize that at any point to find the base directory of our project. So that's always useful to have. Right, so next up, we're going to create a new class. We're going to call this config. And we don't need that, but we then go ahead and now we can start to specify our configuration for our application. So I'm just going to pass there for now, because what we're going to, in addition to that, we're going to make a new class for our development config. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to inherit all the information from the config class. There we go. So going back, going back to the diagram that we saw previously, what we have now is on the right-hand side here, we have the base config class set up, and we're inheriting all those settings, those generic settings that we might use on multiple configurations, in this case, within our development config. Now, if you would like to, you can also make a separate configuration for maybe production. So this is going to be our production config, and we can go ahead and again inherit from config. Obviously, we don't have any settings there at the moment, but that's the general idea. Now, something that may be generic to both the development and production config is the secret key. So let's specify the secret key. So here in Flask, the secret key configuration option is used to provide cryptographic security for various operations, such as generating session cookies, CSRF protection, and cryptographic signing. So it is important that we keep it safe. We don't want anyone else to be able to find this key. So we do want to try and secure it at all times. So we're going to load it in from the environment variables. Now, what we're going to do here then is define an environment variable and access it. So remember that we have already configured, if we go into the core, we have already configured the load.env package that we installed, and we activated it there. So how we can now access that is that in our config secret key here, we can say this equals os.get the environment variable. Then we just need to specify which environment variable to use. So instead of using plain text here, we just specify in this case, an environment variable called secret key. So now what we need to do is create a new file called .env. So that's in the main directory again, the fkcommerce directory, if you don't already have one. And then we can go ahead and specify our secret key and use some sort of random secret key. So the question you might have at the moment is, how big should this secret key be? Well, a secret key with a length of at least 32 bytes, which corresponds to 256 bits of entropy. So that would be a good size to use, so 256 bits. Now, there are systems or there are websites online which provide a way of generating these types of keys, and no doubt there are Python ways to do that too. But at this point, as long as you've got a nice random key, that's a good starting point. So simply put, now within our diagram, the secret key setting is going to be defined here within our basic config. It's going to be passed along the line. So when we create our Flask instance, it's going to be available within our Flask instance to be utilized by Flask. We can also set up a default. So if we use a comma here, we can set up some sort of default secret key if we like. If, for example, the secret key environment variable isn't available, but it will be available, so we're not going to worry about that. So let's use the environment variable there. So the Flask env environment variable controls the environment mode of the Flask application. So there are three common values that we can place within this environment variable: development, production, or testing. So we can specify that right here. So Flask env. Let's set that to, well, let's go ahead and set that in the environment variable again. So we'll go ahead and set that. So that's going to be Flask env. So let's go to Flask env. So we're going to start off with the development. So why three modes? Well, each mode will serve a specific purpose, and it has its own configuration settings behind the scenes and behavior. So if we set development, that generally means that it provides features like automatic reloading of the application when core code changes are detected. It might provide detailed error messages with traceback and an interactive debugger for handling exceptions. So if we run it in production mode, this is going to be optimized for performance, reliability, and security in the production environment. And we have the third mode, which is testing. And this is all about testing, of course. So it's going to provide different features, such as features to facilitate testing, a separate test database, utilities for mocking, patching, and specializing test libraries, like, for example, Flask testing. So this is going to help us, or help the Flask application behave correctly and effectively in different scenarios and environments. So here we set the default to development, but what we might like to do is potentially override that setting in, for example, production. So if we were using the production configuration, although we're importing or using all the settings in the base config class, we can go ahead and potentially override that and say, well, this is going to be production. So we can go ahead and maybe potentially override that setting when we use the production config. So we also have a debug option, a few different options. So a debug option, os.get env, and then we go ahead and debug that. So we set up the debug. So again, we'll pass that into the environment variables. This would be the default. So debug equals, let's set that to true. Okay, and of course what we can then, of course, do is override that maybe in one of our configuration options here. So let's just make sure that debug equals true is always the case. So let's say debug equals, this is an override. Obviously we don't need it at this point because it's set to default to true, but let's make sure that in the development configuration, when we're running our application with the development configuration, debug will also always, be true. We want to make sure, ideally, that debug is false in production. So we go ahead and change that. So if we run our application in the production configuration, debug should be false. Hopefully with that small configuration, you're getting the general idea of what we're doing. So what we need to do now is to tell our application to actually use one of these configuration options. So let's go back into the core and the initialization file. I have it already open. What we're going to do now is just pass in that. So we'll start this approach with this approach. So we'll pass in config, the config type right here. It seems a little bit messy. We don't have to do it this way, but so let's get environment variables, and we're going to then specify the config type. So we're going to specify the config type in the environment variables. So let's do that. So we're going to need to import OS for that. Okay, so config type. So let's set the default config type to development. So that's going to be config.development. There we go. So I need to make sure now that we initiate that. So we do app, so extending the app and the configuration within our app, and then we're going to import the custom settings from object, and then we just need to specify the config type that we passed in. So config type, and there we go. So that's going to apply the new settings when we make a new instance of our Flask application. So with that in place, let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and run Flask. Ooh, it looks like the module config has no attribute development. So we've named that incorrectly at the moment inside the config file. So remember this was called development config. Do apologize. That's what we're looking for. So let's try that again. And there we go. So it looks like it's now found our configuration file and we now have our server running. Okay, so you might have the question at this point, well, why is debug mode off when we've set debug true? Well, there's two debugging options here, let's say. So if I want to turn debug mode on, in actual fact, what I probably need to do is in my environment variables, add Flask debug. So if I just add that to my environment variables, I'll then go ahead and run my Flask app again. You can see now debug mode is on. And you can see it tells me down here, we have the debugger active. So we have two options here, Flask debug and debug. So the Flask debug, this refers to running with the debugger in Flask, activating the workzerg debugger. This is a powerful tool that intercepts unhandled exceptions and provides an interactive debugging interface in the browser when an error occurs during the execution of our application. So some really useful information. Compare that to setting the debug configuration. Now, this option in Flask, on the other hand, enables the debug mode for your application. So debug mode provides additional features like automatic reloading of your application when code changes are detected, detailed error messages, and an interactive debugger for handling exceptions. So while both running with the debugger and the setting to debug configuration option, this will enhance your debugging experience and is useful when you're developing in your development environment. Now, I apologize, I'm not providing any examples here of this in action, but as we start to make mistakes, potentially we'll start to see this in action. It provides some useful feedback. So that's the settings that I'm going to end up with so that we have both the Flask debug and debug set to true. Now I have made maybe a complete mismatch of settings here, but hopefully I'm just trying to lay the foundation, the idea of creating a modular approach to building your configuration files. Of course, you might need to also configure this now because you don't want Flask debug to be true when working in a production environment. That's not something you want to include. But this is just for learning purposes at the moment and understand the basics of Flask. So there would be some other considerations and configuration settings to organize in a certain way to really enhance and utilize this type of setup. But like I said, hopefully you get the general idea and the general development direction that we're taking, creating this kind of modular approach.